Well, I'm very pleased today to welcome Ben Dyson to our platform. I guess this will be number 37 or 36 seminar being held during the last, I think, 3 or 4 years with the Paris One University, which we are very pleased also to have this excellent relationship. At the same time, we are welcoming our partner in Madrid, Professor Celia Gonzalo, and the attendants in that side. So most welcome to everyone. Well, Ben, I enjoyed last night listening to your Copenhagen seminar. It was very interesting, about half an hour, and I liked it a lot. So thank you very much. We are waiting and to listen for a very important topic and maybe radical with respect to change to the monetary system. By this, I will leave the floor to Dr. Ahmed Balwafi, who I need to thank him, in fact, because for his effort to arrange for this important seminar. So thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Please go ahead and introduce Dr. Ben.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah, for the introduction and for welcoming Mr. Bean and the rest of audiences in Madrid and in Paris. I'm really so pleased to have Mr. Ben Dyson sharing with us the things that they are working on in positive money to make some changes that will work for the whole society, not only for a segment of it, as they argue for that. And I'm really, I would like to thank him for sparing this time and sharing with us the views. And the title that he has suggested is Addressing the Global Debt Crisis Through Sovereign Money. And Mr. Dyson is a co-author of a book entitled Modernising Money, Why Our Monetary System is Broken and How It Can Be Fixed. He argues that a design flaw in the banking system which allows banks to effectively create more than 97%, that is, I think, the case in United Kingdom, and also it is similar pattern in other places. So according to some statistics, this varies from about 70 to 97, we might say the extreme case in the UK. Of the money power that our economy runs is responsible for the financial crisis. So he is suggesting that we might say the cause of all causes, or the root cause of financial crisis is this thing of money creation, unaffordable housing, and the government's reliance on unsustainable debt-fueled growth. So the proposals were recently featured, as he says, in the Financial Times. And Mr. Ben is the founder and head of research at Positive Money Movement, a movement that is a campaign for banking system that works, as we said, for the whole society. So, Mr. Ben, I will hand over the platform for you, and please, I've been asked by the organizers to give you 40 minutes for the talk, and then we'll have about half to 40 minutes as well, because our tradition is to have a discussion and to have a lively debate. That is very, very important in academia and in practice as well. So please, the microphone is yours, and I wish you all the best.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think everybody is familiar with this concept that money is power. What I want you to think about is, what if you had the power to actually create money? What would you do with that power? And I think just for the next 3 minutes, if you have a discussion between yourselves, if you had the power to create money, how would you use it? So please just discuss that for the next 2 minutes.
So please, Paris and Madrid and here in Jeddah, come to an answer to the question, isn't it?
Think about it.
Sophie, if you go to slide 3.
So you want us to answer to this question?
Yes.
I'd make lots of it.
It's a very difficult question.
I guess distribute in a more equal society.
Good answer.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
I'm answering on behalf of Abdurrahim Mustafi. I use the
Immaculada is now going to answer the question.
What would you do with the power to create money?
I'm answering on behalf of Abdurrahim
After
Mustafi.
creating,
I use that money to marry 4 women.
so you have limited money, I assume.
Madrid,
Okay.
I think you want to answer the question. Would you cut the mic?
And in Jeddah, is there any?
Mr. Ben,
Yes.
just let me answer this question. We are allowed to, we are given the power to create money. That could be misuse or abuse of power, in short form.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Some interesting ideas then. So next slide, Sophie, please. So quite a few people, their first idea is to use this power to benefit themselves. I'm sure nobody would be honest enough to say whether that was their idea, but or alternatively, people may say, well, there's a way to use this power to benefit society. Next slide, Sophie. But I think one question that is really interesting about this power to create money is, sorry, next slide, is really these 2 questions, which have already been raised. If you had this power, when would you stop using it? And how can everybody else, whether it's us here or the rest of society, trust you not to overuse that power and not to abuse it? So what I want to talk about now is, next slide, who actually has the power to create money. And next slide. So who creates notes and coins? I think most people probably know this.
Yes.
Central banks.
Central banks.
Yeah, central banks. So the European Central Bank for the euro, the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia for the money in Saudi Arabia. Next slide. Okay, who creates electronic money? The numbers that you see in your bank account. And this is something that people don't really think about. They assume that the electronic money in their account represents physical cash in the bank. Next slide. What it actually is just numbers in a computer system. So there's nothing you can touch there. It's just numbers in an accounting system. Next slide. So a lot of people find this quite hard to believe the first time that they're told. This is a Bank of England publication about the way that money is created. And it explains who actually creates the money. Next slide. So what they say is commercial banks create money in the form of bank deposits by making new loans. Next slide. When a bank makes a loan, for example, to someone taking out a mortgage to buy a house, it does not typically do so by giving them thousands of pounds worth of banknotes. Next slide. Instead, it credits their bank account with a bank deposit the size of the mortgage. At that moment, new money is created. So this is actually quite simple accounting. I don't really want to explain the accounting process, but there's nothing illegal about this process. It's just the way that accounting works in the banking system. So in terms of who actually creates electronic money, it is the banks that create bank deposits, which are the numbers you see in your account, and it's the state through the central bank which creates physical cash. Next slide. Next slide again. So bank deposits in the UK make up 97% of all of the money that exists.
We cannot hear it.
Sorry, Ben.
Can you hear now? Can you hear now?
Can you hear us?
I can hear Madrid. Sophie, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Perfect.
Also, Jed, I can hear you.
Okay, so Jed is okay.
Yeah.
Paris is okay.
Debe ser cosa suya.
Madrid, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we know.
So we have... Sorry, Madrid, please turn your microphone off. Thank you. So the banks create 97% of money, and the state, through the central banks, create the other 3% of money. Next slide. These are figures for the UK, but you have similar situations in every other country. Something between about 80% and 97% of the money is created by the central bank. Next slide. So this shows you, for the UK, how much money has been created by the banking system, running up to, up to 2015, but you can see how it peaked around the time of the crisis. And because banks create money by lending, every new amount of money that they create creates new debt as well. Next slide. And so you can see here all of the debt that is created at the same time as this money. And this is one of the problems with the current monetary system, that money is created when banks make loans. So it's created as debt. Next slide. So just think for a second, if money is created when a bank makes a loan, what happens when the loan is repaid? Next slide. So this again is from the Bank of England publication. They say, just as taking out new loans creates money, the repayment of bank loans destroys money.
No, sí, no, hasta ahora puesto.
Madrid, could you switch off your microphone?
We cannot hear you.
It's a problem because we hear you for like a minute and then the sound is gone. So I believe this is from the originator, which is in France or in Japan? London.
Sophie, how is the sound for you?
No.
We cannot hear you now.
Here it's fine.
Okay.
Es un decir que van a
Now?
Entonces se parece que está conectando.
Can you hear me now, Sophie?
We cannot hear you, but even
Yes,
if we
it's fine
switch
for
off
me.
the microphone, we don't receive your signal.
Oh, okay. Okay, so leave it on then. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. So just as taking out a new loan creates money, the repayment of bank loans destroys money. Next slide. Banks making loans and consumers repaying them are the most significant ways in which bank deposits are created and destroyed in the modern economy. So this is how the system works. When banks make loans, they create new money, and when loans are repaid, that money is destroyed, and it's removed from the economy. Okay. So next slide, please, Sophie. So this is, in terms of where the power to create money is at the moment, it's really with the banks. It is the banks that actually have this power to create money. Now, next slide, please. So I want to talk about what banks actually do with this power. Next slide. The question is, do they use it to benefit themselves, or do they use it to benefit society? Next slide, and next slide again, please. Okay, so this is the way that people typically think of banks, as taking savings from savers and then putting it into the banking system, and then they go and lend it to businesses and to any entrepreneur, so that people and create jobs. We just lost Madrid. But this is actually not really the way the system works. It's a little bit like a fairy tale. Next slide. So this is a quote by Adair Turner, who was the head of the UK's bank regulator for 5 years throughout the financial crisis. And he says, most undergraduate textbooks say, well, what banks do is they take deposits from households to businesses. As a description of what modern advanced economy banking systems do, this is completely mythological. And the reason for that, the reason why he says that this idea of banks taking money and then lending it to businesses is wrong, is because of what they actually do, because what they actually do is quite different. Next slide.
Excuse me, Ben. Majid,
Yes?
are you with us? Just to check with Majid, are you with us?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
So what banks actually do, only 8% of the money that they created in the decade before the financial crisis went into businesses, was lent to businesses and to the real economy. Next slide. Another 8% went to consumer loans for credit cards and personal loans. Next slide. 31% of the money that they created went into the financial sector, so to parts of financial speculation, mergers and acquisitions, all other parts of the financial sector. Next slide. And 51%, so more than half of all the money they created went straight into property. These figures are for the UK, but you have a very similar pattern, definitely in Europe and America, and I think it's a similar pattern in many other countries in the world as well. So the idea that the main thing that banks do is invest in businesses is completely wrong, because that's one of the smallest things that they do. Most of the money that banks create goes into the property market. So if you could skip forward 2 slides. So let's look at the consequences here. The first thing is that because of all this money going into property, it pushes house prices up. It makes houses more expensive. And this has happened in particular it's happened in Spain, happened in Ireland, happened in Denmark, in the UK. I'm sorry, I'm not sure about the situation in Saudi Arabia. Next slide. If house prices rise, people have to borrow more. They have to take out larger mortgages, so household debt rises. Next slide. It's also the fact that banks are very keen to lend to people through credit cards and personal loans, so that also increases household debt. Next slide. Now, if you have rising house prices, that increases inequality, because people who can afford to get a mortgage benefit from those prices rising. There's people on lower incomes who are renting or can't get the deposit to buy a house, don't benefit, and they end up paying somebody else's mortgage. And also high household debt means that there's a distribution through interest payments from everybody to the banking system and then to the top 10% of the population. Next slide. And now there's a lot of research that shows that when you have a high level of household debt and you have growing inequality, those are the conditions that create a financial crisis. Next slide. So here, Adair Turner again, saying the financial crisis of 2007-2008 occurred because we failed to constrain the private financial system's creation of private credit and money. So essentially, we allowed banks to create too much money. That was what caused the financial crisis. Next slide. This is an academic study of, I think, 60% of the world's economy over 140 years, and they found that the main thing that predicts a financial crisis is the speed of the increase in the level of debt before the crisis. And they say, so credit, which is debt growth, is a powerful predictor of financial crises, suggesting that such crises are credit booms gone wrong, and that policymakers ignore credit at their peril. When they talk about credit here, they're really talking about money creation by the banking sector. Next slide. So once you have a financial crisis, that inevitably leads to a recession. Next slide. Recession leads to unemployment because businesses make people redundant. They can't hire as many people. Next slide. Obviously, when you have rising unemployment, you also have rising inequality. Next slide. It also, when you have a recession, because businesses are making less money and people are earning less, then tax revenue for the government falls. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, and then that really forces governments to implement this austerity measures, where they cut public services. That again, next slide, leads to, it increases unemployment, it increases inequality. And then finally, next two slides. Okay, because governments, because their finances are in a really bad position, it's one of the things that they often do is they say, well, we can no longer afford to protect the environment because now we just need to focus on the economic recovery. So in the UK, the government here has taken away many of the protections for the environment that it took 20 years to put in place because they are assessing everything compared to whether it will affect economic growth. And also, you know, when the government is unable to implement the policies that we vote for them to do, that really reduces democracy. Okay, so Sophie, if you could go forward 4 slides. Yes. So really what positive money says is, since this is really the root of many of the social and economic problems that we face today, we need to address the problem at the roots, and we need to change the way that banks create money. Next slide. So we want to transfer this power to create money from where it is at the moment with the banks to the state. Next slide. And sorry, next slide again. So the idea is here not to give politicians the power to create money, because they also have an incentive to abuse that power, but to make sure that this power is with a transparent, democratic, accountable public body that is working in the public interest. So looking at the long-term health of the economy and society and deciding how much money to create in order to meet that objective. This last part is really important. It must be in the public interest. Now, there's a question, how do you measure what is in the public interest? Next slide. Next slide. Okay, and these, I think you could measure the public interest against some of these criteria. So, house prices, are houses affordable or completely unaffordable? Does the system lower household debt or cause it to always increase? Does it lower inequality? Does it lower the risk of a financial crisis? Does it lower the risk of recessions? Does it create jobs or does it cause unemployment? Does it support democracy or work against it? Does it protect the environment? And does it improve government finances or make them worse? So, next slide. In terms of, the good news is that we are actually making some progress towards transferring that power to create money from the banks to the state. So, pre-2008, we had this situation where it was only really the banks creating money, and they created 97% of all the money in the economy. Next slide. Next slide. And then what happened was you had the financial crisis, and banks were very scared about what was happening in the economy, so they became unwilling to lend. And what that means is if they're not lending, then they're not creating money. Next slide. So what happened was the central bank in the UK and in America said, if the banks aren't creating money, then we need to create money instead. Otherwise, the economy will crash, basically. Next slide. This is Mervyn King, who's the governor was the governor, the top guy at the Bank of England for 10 years. And he said, a damaged banking system means that today banks aren't creating enough money, so we have to do it for them. So this was the idea behind quantitative easing. Next slide. Okay, so in the USA, I think the USA implemented this first. They have now done 4.5 trillion of quantitative easing. So they have created $4.5 trillion of new money through this process. In the UK, it's been 375 billion. Next slide. In Europe, this policy has just started in 2015, and it will run until 2017. It's already been extended for 6 months, but it's 1.4 trillion euros. And in Japan, they've also started this program for $1.4 trillion. So this is a huge program of central banks creating money. Now, was this in the public interest? And I would argue no. Next slide. And the reason for that is the way that the policy was used. So in the case of the UK, which is the same way that they've done it in Europe and the US, they created £375 billion, and they put it into the bond markets. And what that does, next slide, it pushes up the prices of bonds by about 20%. That's the estimate of the Bank of England. Now, the idea behind this is that if you increase the price of bonds and stocks, it makes people feel wealthier, and they should go out and spend. But about 40% of the assets in the bond market are held by the richest 10% of households. And what this means is that this richest 10%, as a result of quantitative easing, benefits by about £128,000 in increased wealth per household. But the vast majority of people don't benefit at all. So they don't feel this. Economists talk about the trickle-down effect. And quantitative easing was all based on the idea that the wealth would trickle down by making the rich wealthier and then letting that money trickle down to everybody else. And it doesn't work. Next slide. And the actual idea itself was flawed because remember that when people repay loans, the money is destroyed and it disappears. What happened after the crisis was that businesses were repaying loans, and so were households, but banks weren't issuing new loans. And so money was actually disappearing from households and from consumers. What quantitative easing did, next slide, was recreate some of that money, but put it back into the financial markets. So it put the money into the wrong place. Next slide. So the overall effects of this, firstly, there's some evidence that it increased house prices by making the wealthy wealthier and encouraging them to invest more money in assets and property. It actually works. One of the aims of quantitative easing is to increase bank lending, which will increase household debt, even though that's the problem that caused the crisis. It increases inequality because it works by increasing the wealth of the wealthiest. It has increased the risk of financial crisis because putting all of this money, these hundreds of billions of pounds or euros into the financial markets, encourages people and traders in the financial markets to take higher risks. It's had very little impact on employment. We've calculated that every £1 of quantitative easing in the UK has led to about 8 pence of extra spending in the real economy. So only about 8% of the money that is created actually has an impact on spending and jobs and employment. There is also evidence that it's been damaging to the environment, and the reason for that is that a lot of this money that has been pumped into financial markets has pushed down the returns that investors earn on their bonds and their investments in those markets. And it's encouraged them to, the phrase in economics is to search for yield. So to go looking for higher risk investments. A lot of that money has moved to emerging economies like Brazil, Russia, India, China. And there's some evidence there that, a lot of this investment has been quite damaging to the environment. The only thing it really has done successfully is improve government finances by lowering the cost to the government of borrowing. So this policy, although it is money creation by the state, it's not in the public interest. Next slide. So the good news now is that there are some new ideas coming up. Next slide. And people are saying, well, we've had this situation where the banks create money, and that didn't work so well. And we now have the situation where the central banks are creating money, but they're putting it into the financial markets, and that's not working well. What we should do is allow the state to create money and put it into the real economy. And there's two ways that this could happen. Next slide. The first is that the central bank would create money, transfer it to the government, and then the government would use that money for public investment. So this idea has a few different names. It's also known as QE for the people, quantitative easing for the people, green quantitative easing, QE for infrastructure, monetary financing of fiscal deficits. These are all the economic terms for this. The second idea, next slide, is that the central bank could create the money and then it divides it equally between every citizen. So everybody receives an equal share of the money. So next slide. Okay, so if you look at the example of the Eurozone, they're planning to create 1.4 trillion euros over the next 24 months. If you did this as a citizen's dividend, so you divided that money up and gave it to every Eurozone citizen, next slide, that would be about 180 euros per citizen per month, and they could choose how to spend that. if you give that money directly to people, they'll spend it, and it creates employment. We've estimated that this would be 3 to 14 times more effective than QE at boosting GDP. If you were to use the money for public investment, we estimate that that would be 2 to 14 times more effective than QE at boosting GDP, because you're instead of putting the money into the financial markets and waiting for the money to somehow trickle down to the real economy, you're putting it directly into the real economy. Next slide. So this is just some of the people that are in favour of these kind of ideas. Adair Turner, again, was the head of the UK's bank regulator for 5 years through the financial crisis. Ben Bernanke, who was the former chairman of the US Federal Reserve. And Willem Buter, who is the chief economist of Citigroup. So although this is quite a radical idea, some of the people advocating it are very influential people. And on our website, we have a list of about 40 different, quite high-profile economists who are saying this is now the right thing to do. Next slide. Okay, now, sorry, this should say, at the top, this should say, would this be in the public interest? So this policy of either using money creation for public investment or a citizen's dividend, it does not increase household debt. There's no increase in inequality. It reduces the risk of a financial crisis because it allows the real economy to grow, which means there is less risk of the economy collapsing. Again, it reduces the risk of recession. Because the money goes into the real economy, it creates jobs. Because it provides more funding for government, it can increase the capacity of government. It can protect the environment, particularly if the government uses this public investment in order to invest in renewable energy, public transport, transition into a cleaner economy, and it improves government finances. Some of these advantages depend on which policy you use. Now, because there is such a huge amount of debt in the global economy, since the financial crisis, the level of debt has increased by about 40%. So we haven't actually paid down the debt that caused the crisis. We've just added to it. And we can no longer keep growing the economy by encouraging people to borrow more. So it's very likely that this policy will happen in the next 2 years, that the state, through the central bank, will create money and put that money into the real economy. And what that would mean is that the power to create money would become shared between the state and the banks. Next slide. So that would really be going halfway towards what positive money wants in the long term. But it's not perfect because there are still dangers. So if you successfully use this policy to get the economy growing again, the dangers are that the banks will then be encouraged to start lending more. So that increases the risk of another house price bubble. It also increases the risk that they'll feel more confident to lend through credit cards and personal loans. Inequality, if this happens, then inequality will start rising again. There is still a risk. The banks would still have quite an unstable and risky business model and structure. So it depends on very complex regulation to stop them causing another financial crisis. And if the banks do fail again, we would still need to rescue those banks. So what we would like to see in the long term, next slide, is a situation where banks are prohibited from being able to create money and the state creates 100% of money. Now this is quite a radical idea. It's also quite technical, so I don't want to explain the mechanics of how it works today. Next slide. We have quite a comprehensive book that explains how this proposal would work, but you can also, on the Positive Money website, there's a paper that you can read that explains in in plain English, how you could implement a proposal to stop banks creating money. Now, it is much more radical than the idea of the state creating money at the same time as the banks, but it is also getting some quite high-profile support. So, next slide. This is an article by Martin Wolf, who is the chief economics commentator for the Financial Times, and he wrote this after he read the book that I just showed you there. He called the article, the headline is "Strip Banks of Their Power to Create Money." Next slide. And he says, this proposal would bring huge advantages. It would be possible to increase the money supply without encouraging people to borrow to the hilt. It would end too big to fail in banking. It would also transfer seigniorage, the benefits from creating money, to the public. So he's come out strongly in favour of this. In Switzerland, yes, next slide, please. In Switzerland, there's just been a referendum where they collected 112,000 signatures from members of the public saying we should stop banks from being able to create money. And because of the way Swiss democracy works, that means there will be a referendum. In the Netherlands, they had a petition. They collected 113,000 signatures from people saying we should stop banks creating money. And in Iceland, the Prime Minister there commissioned a study into the benefits of stopping banks creating money in Iceland. And that now is, the report has been released and that's available online. And now the people who worked on that report are trying to get a more detailed inquiry into whether this is something they should do. Okay, I've just got 3 minutes left. I just want to tell you about some of the things that we're doing to make this happen. Next slide. Next slide. In the UK, we have about 30 different groups of people around the country, and they meet and they learn more about the way the system works. And they campaign and put pressure on politicians. Next slide. We found out that in the UK, we did a professional survey of politicians, and we found out that 7 out of 10 of them think that the government creates 100% of the money already. And only, next slide. So only 1 out of 10 of them actually understood that it is the banks that create the money and also destroy it when loans are repaid. So politicians don't really understand the monetary system. We had we managed to arrange a debate in Parliament. So this is actually the members, the politicians debating the way that the money creation system works. That's the first time that it's been debated in the UK in 170 years. We also did a petition which was handed into so that is the house of the Prime Minister that you can see in the background. Next slide. Next slide. In Europe, because we have this policy of quantitative easing, which even though it didn't work in the UK and the US, they're doing the same thing in Europe. So we've launched a campaign in Europe called Quantitative Easing for People. So that's the website address there. And the idea of that is to say there are many better things that could be done with this 1.4 trillion euros, like the public investment or even just dividing it between every citizen. Next page. So there are international movements all around the country, all around the world now. There's one in Spain and there's also one in France. And we're trying to support that international movement to help it grow. For anybody who's interested, the guys in France and Spain, this is the website where you can find the contact details for the group in your country. And then finally, if you want to learn more about this system, next slide, what I would really recommend is just go to the Positive Money website. We have a lot of things you can read there for free. We also have a 1-hour animation which explains technically how the banking system works. And that's used in quite a few universities in the UK to help people understand the way the system works. So that's a really good resource for understanding more about this whole monetary system. So yeah, the website is positivemoney.org. You can join us on Facebook and Twitter, and also sign up for the email if you'd like to learn more about the thing. So yeah, so that's the presentation. I guess now we can do